Hello everyone, I'm Dr. John Gross and welcome to another GIS lecture video. In this lecture video I want to continue our discussion in the series What is a Map by actually providing a definition and explanation of what is a map. So it may be surprising because I think everybody intuitively sort of has an idea in their head of what a map is, but it is so widespread in today's society that an actual true definition of a map is actually somewhat difficult. So the way I approach it is to stick with sort of the classic definition of what is a map. Right. And so whenever I think of a map, I always think of the definition of it's a graphic representation of spatial data that shows spatial relationships. Right. And so I want to highlight a couple of keywords, right? It's a graphic, meaning we're talking about an image. So this ties into other related things like graphs and charts, right? It is a visual thing as opposed to a tabular thing like a table. So maps actually do have a lot in common with other types of charts, even down to the fact that they work on a coordinate system, which we'll talk about in future videos. So it is a graphic, so it's a visual representation of spatial data. So this is what really separates it from charts and graphs, is the sense that we are explicitly dealing with spatial data. And I'm hoping at this point you already have a solid grasp of what spatial data is, but just to digress a little bit, when we talk about spatial data, we're talking about things that have an explicit location. And being able to take those locations, put them into a graphic representation to be able to explicitly show something called a spatial relationship. So what does a spatial relationship mean? Well, it could mean, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about the different types of maps that exist, but there's really sort of two categories of spatial relationships, right? There are the spatial patterns. Actually, let's make that a different color. Hold on. Let's make that blue. So when we talk about spatial relationships, there's really two things we look at. We look at spatial patterns, right? So this could be trends in a data set over time or over space. So maybe you're looking for how a disease is spreading over time, or maybe you're looking at a snapshot of how weather patterns are distributed across space. So that's a sort of a single variable. You're looking at patterns in that. Or we could be looking at spatial relationships between data sets. Right? Maybe we're looking to see how our hospitals are laid out along a road network, for example. Right? And these are best done visually through the creation of a map. So I think that although this is a relatively simple explanation, it is a powerful relationship in that simplicity because it covers so many different things. And what I want to do here to end this video is I want to take a step back and I want you to think about things that you've seen that you would consider maps. What kinds of things do they have in common? Because as we go through the course, you're going to be drawing on all these different inspirations as you go through and you make your own maps, because the process of making a map or cartography is as much an artistic expression, especially around the margins when we talk about elements, as it is a scientific and mathematical endeavor in terms of the the geodesy and making sure the coordinate systems are correct and scales and all that kind of stuff. But I really want you to start thinking what a map is at its most basic form. And the other thing I want to say here is to sort of bring up the idea of things that we may not necessarily consider maps in the traditional sense. And if you ever have the opportunity, I would strongly encourage you to look up Pacific Islander stick maps. Pacific Islander stick maps. And they're a sort of old version of maps that don't look anything like what we would traditionally consider maps. And what it was is it was a combination of shells and reeds that would lay out the organization of islands in the archipelagos and the chains and the ways that they would navigate them, represented by sticks. And so even though we might look at that and say, oh, that's not a map, but it was, right? Because it was a graphic representation, right? Using the shells and the sticks and the reeds of spatial data, because they were organizing where these different locations were. And it showed the relationship between data sets and between objects, right? So with this definition of a map, right, it's not just the sort of traditional atlases and thematic maps that we traditionally think of. So hopefully this makes sense. This definition makes sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.